So, for example, our heart, we kind of recognize how our heart is beating, but we cannot actually really, directly control it. And the same goes with our sexual function. We cannot directly control it. So we can't say, now I want my arousal now to be on, or I want it, to be like this or like that, or the duration or whatever. So sexual function is not something that we own, and therefore we can promise to someone, or we can, give to someone whenever the other person asks for it.
You're listening to In Bed with Science, a sex podcast. I'm Lee Noren, a sex therapist with a Master of Science in Sexology and over 12 years of coaching, counseling, and therapy experience. Today is part 2 of a 2-part series on sexual performance anxiety. I'm talking to Dr. Evie Kirana about how to deal with performance anxiety in bed. We get into the very real mind-body connection, no woo here, you know that's not me, strictly science here, and what to do if you're struggling. So last time it was more theoretical, and this time we're going to get more practical. But first, do you have a sex or relationship question you want to ask, but you're not quite sure where to turn? Now's your chance. I'm looking for thoughtful, personal questions about things like intimacy, mismatched libidos, emotional disconnect, and struggles with sexual pleasure and desire. Specifically, those messy, non-Hollywood experiences that we all have but rarely talk about. And I'll be answering them in upcoming episodes of the podcast with both compassion and scientific insight. Submit your story or question anonymously, or with your name if you'd like, and it might be featured in a future episode. Dr. Evie Kirana is a health psychologist and clinical sexologist based in Athens, Greece. She's spent nearly 2 decades specializing in sexual medicine, treating thousands of people with sexual concerns like erectile dysfunction, and leading the Center for Sexual and Reproductive Health. She also lectures internationally and is one of the co-founders of International Online Sexology Supervisors. Dr. Evie Kirana, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, it's very nice to be here.
I'd love to start with hearing a bit about how you got into sex therapy and research.
Well, I'm a psychologist. I was very much interested in health psychology. So my first master's degree was in health psychology. So this means, we look at how our psychology influences the function of our body, so our physical functioning, and vice versa. So that was what was very interesting to me. And then I got into the field of sex research. And during my first year, I did a very big study here in Greece, where I saw that about 40% of the general population is coping with some kind of sexual problem. 40%, the study was from 18 years old to 80 years old. So it was a very large study. So at that point, I thought, okay, I want to invest more in this field. So after that, I started doing training in the clinical aspects of sexology, and I haven't stopped since. That's my field for about 25 years, I think.
Yeah, wow. That's dedication for 25 years.
Yes, it is. But I think it's fascinating because, again, sexology and our sexual functioning demonstrates very well how our psychology impacts our function, how our body functions, our genitals function, but also our interactions, like with our partners, but also what we expect from from society and from the environment that we live in, and then also the information that we have. All these kind of get together, and they influence our experience.
Yeah. And did I understand correctly that you focused a lot on like erectile function and premature ejaculation?
Yeah, I have focused on sexual dysfunctions, both in men and in women. I've worked out a little bit more with men, but that's probably because men seek treatments more. It's not that they deal with problems more often than women. It's just that men seek treatment. Plus, as you probably already know, we've had more treatment options for men compared to women. Research has been much faster, has progressed much more in the field of men than in women. So, yeah.
interesting. I'm trying not to veer too far off into other territory, but I just wanted to touch on what you said about how men seek treatment more, because my experience has been the opposite, that women have been more inclined to seek treatment. Is this something you've kind of seen yourself clinically, or does the research also show that men are more prone to seek treatment?
That is data from the research. It's also my experience, but our experience can be biased because it really, it's about our referral processes and what people know us about. But research shows that, it's men usually seek treatment much more than women, even though women have experienced sexual problems much more than men. This is explained by the fact that it might be that men are more bothered than women, so therefore they seek treatment. Plus all the reasons that I mentioned before, that our scientific field has more tools to treat men, and therefore this encouraged men to seek treatment more.
Your paper that we're focusing on today, it discusses sexual performance anxiety, or SPA, because it's such a long word to say every time. And you and Dr. David Rowland, you proposed this kind of new clinical model to deal with SPA. And before we're going to dig into this model and really look at a few kind of helpful tips for people listening, I wanted to talk a bit about how we in society talk about SPA. Because from my perspective, I feel like we often talk about it as this male thing, that there's this performance anxiety for men. And I've wondered if it's because for men, it's much more visually clear if you have an erection compared to a woman or a person with a vulva, but also because of gender roles, where I feel like we often view men as kind of less emotional, more kind of doers, and they're meant to kind of function, compared to women and people of other genders. Do you agree with this? And if so, why do you think that we focus less on female SPA when it clearly impacts them too?
I agree with you, although I think that we don't focus on sexual performance anxiety very much anyways, because I think that culturally speaking, we don't expect men or women to experience sexual performance anxiety, right? And that's why most people, when they do experience it, they think it's just them. They think it's just themselves. So I would like to start with this, saying that I think that sexual performance anxiety is different, but also has many similarities in stage anxiety and sports anxiety. So anybody that has experienced like sports anxiety, say in football, or somebody, while lecturing, it's quite similar. I think it's often not that unique to sexual situations, although sexual situations have their own characteristics, right? But I don't think it's something that unique. So going back to your question, first of all, we experience sexual performance anxiety when we're about to enter a situation, a sexual situation that we perceive as important. We expect to achieve specific performance standards. If we don't, we feel that we will experience consequences, negative consequences from that. So I guess that our society has a very specific idea about how we're supposed to respond physically, emotionally, etc. And I think that we're not really taught that anxiety can be one of those responses, which is quite weird because I think we all humans, we want to respond to the other person's expectations. It is a need, to respond to these expectations. And men, as you said, I think society has imposed a lot of demands to men about, them being always ready, or about them having an erection. Anxiety is a sign of weakness, etc. And I think that these have not been imposed in such a way to women. So even though women can also experience sexual performance anxiety, I think it's more evident usually in men. And, there has to be an evaluator in sexual performance anxiety. Somebody is evaluating us, and this person can be the partner, but I think it's also ourselves. I think in most cases, it's what we expect from ourselves. And you see that the consequence that is the most challenging for someone to deal with when the performance demands are not met are not usually, that the partner might be disappointed or the partner might leave. These can also be, of course, traumatic in some cases. But I think the most frequent consequence is the feeling of shame. So it's how I'm going to experience myself when I don't reach my performance expectations. And this feeling can be very difficult because it's not like what I did is wrong. It's that I am wrong. So it's so overwhelming. And that can happen to a man. It can also happen to a woman.
Yeah, that feeling of shame is something I see so much with my clients too. How do you help your clients deal with shame? I know that's like a really big question, and there are so many different ways.
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, the part that is about education, about discussing what is kind of like normal. So, for example, as I said before, for anxiety to be triggered, it's normal. When you're with someone that, you know, you want to satisfy this person and, you know, you want to, you know, achieve their expectations, etc. It's quite natural to feel some kind of anxiety. But shame is about believing that if you feel anxiety or if you don't have the function that is expected, then your value as a person is less. And that is completely, as I said before, cultural. That's what we learned from our culture. So usually I'm going to work with my clients in trying to understand that this is culturally imposed and that anxiety is normal functioning in our body. And it's absolutely normal not to be able to function sexually while we are under anxiety. It can't occur. So it's normal. I often give a lot of examples of my own life of performance anxiety. For example, I've had stage performance anxiety for many years, and therefore I know what it is about. In a way, I'm sure most people have experienced it in some way. So we usually try to find different, examples of how anxiety has been triggered, etc. And that in the end of the day, it's something very common. I think that the weakness is not about experiencing anxiety. I think our weakness starts when we're not able to manage it. Usually because we kind of try to disregard this anxiety. We try to kind of cover it. I think that's the weakness.
Yeah. And you talk about that in your study as something that can actually make your sexual performance anxiety even worse or increase the intensity. And you talk about one of the ways within this kind of new clinical tool that you've created. You talk about using something called cognitive reappraisal, which essentially, for everyone listening, is kind of, it's a tool that you often give to people with anxiety, where you essentially go in and kind of challenge or alter thoughts using more realistic ones. And then over time, that reduces anxiety. A common thought that I hear, which you also mentioned in your paper, is, my partner's in the mood for sex, so I have to be too. Do you have some examples of alternative thoughts or ways of thinking about that could be helpful for people if they kind of recognize themselves in that example?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that the cognitive reappraisal is, as you said, like we often have various beliefs or thoughts that are not realistic. And these kind of, impact the way we experience the situation. The thoughts are not usually the only factor that is going to trigger the anxiety. And anxiety is very often triggered automatically. So in other words, suppose I'm going to lecture to a big audience and I have anxiety. I know that, I know my topic. I know that nothing bad is going to happen, but still the anxiety can be there and it can be experienced by me. So it's very often automatic after one or two times maybe. So the cognitive reappraisal, in my point of view, plays a very important role mostly in how we're going to manage the anxiety. So it's not that because I have these cognitive distortions or weird thoughts or unrealistic expectations only that I have the anxiety. It's also that these thoughts stop me from managing the situation in a positive way. So if, for example, I believe that experiencing anxiety is a sign of weakness, then I cannot I don't have the tools or the capacity to deal with it in the way I should, because the critical issue in dealing with such kind of anxiety, one of the critical issues is to not fight it while you're experiencing it. The thoughts we have are critical. Any kind of expectation, like the one you said, my partner wants to have sex and I don't, but I have to. Or, I must achieve an erection to satisfy my partner. Sex without penetration is not sex. This is what a woman expects from a man. I should experience an orgasm by a woman, for example. I should experience an orgasm every time. All these thoughts I think they're based on an idea that we control our sexual function, as if we have a joystick and we can control our sexual function. That's not true. It's like our sexual function does not function like our arms and our legs. We can move our arms as we want them to move. We can see how our arms move, and we can also control this. On the other hand, we have functions that we don't recognize and we don't see and we don't control, like our liver, right? We don't see what happens with it and we don't control it. And then we have some kind of functions that are in the middle. So, for example, our heart, we kind of recognize how our heart is beating, but we cannot actually really, directly control it. And the same goes with our sexual function. We cannot directly control it. So we can't say, now I want my arousal now to be on, or I want it, to be like this or like that, or the duration or whatever. So sexual function is not something that we own, and therefore we can promise to someone, or we can, give to someone whenever the other person asks for it. So we need to kind of understand how our sexual function is triggered, how it's hindered, what kind of environment, what kind of factors influence it. And then we need to kind of respect that to a large extent.
For the people listening, because this is something I've noticed quite a bit, that sometimes that kind of information can almost be a bit provocative, that it can make people frustrated and angry, because that's so not how we're used to viewing arousal and desire and orgasm and all of those things. What would you say to them if they're listening now and they're like, but I don't want to accept that I can't control my sexual function?
Yes, I think that this kind of frustration or anger is a sign of the desire to control these, right? And of course, I understand it. I'm sure we would all like to control when our anxiety is triggered and when not. I, for sure, we would all like to control our sexual function. And it's really interesting because in the society that we live in, we control everything. We control what time we're going to wake up, what time we're going to sleep, when we're going to the toilet, what time we're going to have lunch. It's not like we have lunch when we are hungry. We have lunch when it's lunch break. So in a similar way, we think that we would want to, control our sexual function. I totally understand it. It's just that it doesn't work that way. The good thing, though, is if we do, kind of understand our sexuality, we can not only have a sexual function that is nice, but we can actually achieve high levels of sexual satisfaction. But that kind of means that we listen a lot to, and we respect a lot our inner self in a way, how we feel, our needs, our desires.
You talk a lot in your clinical model about replacing performance-focused goals with connection-focused ones. Why would this be helpful? And what could that look like practically if someone's listening, thinking about, okay, what would a connection-focused one be?
Okay, first of all, why? Let's look at this. As I said before, it's quite critical when we experience sexual performance anxiety during a sexual situation, right? And on that moment, that we kind of stop ourselves from fighting against it. We do not try to hide it. We don't try to reverse it. On the other hand, what we try to do is we try to be brave to tolerate it and to allow it to occur even though we don't like it and even though it's bothersome. because this is going to actually gradually stop the whole process. While the more we fight against it, the more we trigger it. It's kind of like as if the brain says, why is this person fighting during sex? There must be a danger. So it's kind of like reinforced all the time that sex is dangerous, etc. So allowing it to occur means that it will occur. Right? So it will gradually stop, but not right away. So allowing it to occur means that we allow our emotional experience and our physical experience, our emotional or physical response to just occur the way it comes. That means that while we have anxiety, it's impossible to have, for example, an erection or to have a good sexual function, because biologically they just cannot co-occur, right? So when we feel anxiety, the blood goes to our arms and to our legs because we go in the fight or flight response. This is the way we're made, and the blood will go away from the genitals. Not only that, our heart will, we're going to have a faster heartbeat so basically the brain says, okay, you're in danger. So we need to pump a lot of blood to the muscles of your arms and your legs so that you can run away or you can fight a situation. And therefore the blood from other places needs to go away because it has to be directed towards your survival mode. This is a reflex. So it's impossible while we have anxiety to also have a sexual function. So it's kind of like as if we would say, okay, I'm in a situation where I'm running fast to catch a flight. I'm running fast to catch my flight, but at the same time, I expect my heartbeat to be normal and not to be fast. It's not possible. So and this is something that happens very often, a lot of people say, okay, I'm going to tolerate my anxiety during sex, but actually I'm waiting for my erection to occur despite me tolerating the anxiety. This cannot happen because this would be something like endurance. It's what we do at the gym. We say, okay, no matter how painful this is and no matter how tired I am, I'm going to finish my workout, an endurance workout. We don't want this kind of thing. This is a torture. We want to accept the way our body feels, even though we don't really like it. So, having a goal that says, I need to achieve the specific sexual function, like a penetration or whatever, is definitely not going to help. It's really torturous. I think that in such a case, it's much better if we select something different. For example, that, I stay present and I stay connected to the moment. So I can stay as much as possible connected to my partner and my sensations, right? What I smell, what I feel, what I touch, what I taste, what I see, not because I'm trying to become aroused, but because I'm trying to stay connected to reality. Whenever we feel anxiety, our attention is focused on disastrous thoughts. So it kind of, pulls us away from reality. We want to kind of help ourselves kind of stay connected to reality. And while we experience this kind of danger, it's much better if we feel connected to someone.
Okay. So I have a lot of different thoughts going on in my mind at the same time. When you were talking about tolerating it and people feeling like they do tolerate it, but actually they're kind of in this tug of war, they're waiting for their erection to kind of come about. What you're saying basically is when you're tolerating it, you're kind of letting yourself experience the anxiety, but you're redirecting your attention to the present.
To now.
To the senses, to kind of anchor in your body where you are.
Exactly. And again, the beliefs of someone will play a role, because if I believe that, it's impossible, it's like the worst thing you can do to a woman, for example, is not to penetrate. It's very difficult to allow yourself to just respond in whatever way your body responds.
Yeah.
Right. So the thoughts and the beliefs there, the expectations, and how rigid or not they are does play a role. And that's why we usually do some kind of therapy. So somebody is not alone in this process, but
Yeah.
Did I answer your question?
Yeah, you did. with the connection focus goals, they're a part of this model, but that's not where you start. I'd love to hear about these kind of 4 phases that you walk clients through for 2 different reasons. One, because I really want people to gain an understanding of what sex therapy can be like, because most people obviously haven't been in sex therapy, and it can feel quite scary and confronting to think about doing it. But also, I'd love for the listeners to walk away with some kind of practical steps that they could follow. Obviously, we can't give them the whole model and they can do it all themselves. That's why we have therapists. But a few different tips, if possible, would be amazing.
Number one is that I think it's very, very important that somebody gets the education, that somebody understands what anxiety is, because, we cannot see it. And maybe we don't all mean the same thing by it. So people need to understand, number one, that sexual function is not a function that we fully control. Number two, anxiety, biologically speaking, is the opposite. It cannot co-occur with sexual functioning. So these are very critical and very key to understand. So these are some basic issues. And another thing that I think is also important in this stage is that anxiety is very often automatically maintained or, triggered. It's not that if logically I see something as safe, it doesn't mean that I'm necessarily going to respond in such a way. So I think this is number one. And then it's also very interesting to see the experience that each person has already had with anxiety, right? As I said before, it might be in sports. It might be in sexual situations for many years. Maybe it was only once. Maybe it was hundreds of times. And what I'm very much interested is in the experience, first of all, the personal experience, what it's like, because a lot of people have never shared this information with anyone before, and how they have tried to manage it. So what have they actually done? What were they doing when they were experiencing anxiety? So for example, if somebody says, when I lose my erection during sex, and I'm going to ask, what do you do? How do you respond? Some people will say, I get up out of bed, I go to the balcony and I'm smoking there for an hour, Somebody else might say, I kind of stop the relationship. I don't show up again the next time with this specific partner. Other people say, I apologize many, many times. Some people say I become very angry. Some people cry. But also, what has the partner's experience been? So these really give us a lot of information about what it means for them not to achieve the sexual function that they expected. Then we can work, a little bit more personally. But it's very interesting, and that's where you usually see the shame. You see how people usually try to cope with the shame, either by, with their anger or with developing distance, different ways. We try to kind of understand how they've been working around this, their thoughts about it, their beliefs. And, it's not that we ever say, and this as a therapist, you're never going to say to someone, what are your beliefs about this? But we do actually, from their words and the way somebody describes their experience, then it's much easier for us to come closer to their beliefs. So, for example, one of the questions I often do is, how do you experience yourself when you lose your erection, for example? The answers that I get indicate their beliefs very much. So, for example, one of the very common answers I would get would be, what do you expect me to experience? I feel like I'm disappearing in the ground, like I'm disappearing in the ground. So, you see how harsh this is, because they expect that this is like normal to have an erection no matter what and no matter what circumstances. And then after that, I gradually introduce the management that might be most effective. And I'm going to talk about that soon. So after we kind of train someone and we discuss thoroughly the management and, of course, any thoughts that somebody might have, oh, no, this won't work, or I cannot do this, or, so we kind of work on these. And then the next part is a part where somebody actually does have sexual experiences. So number one, keep reminding yourself that you're going to need to be brave to tolerate the anxiety. So keep reminding yourself not to fight against it and not to try to hide it, not to try to suppress it. Okay, so you need to kind of remind yourself about this, because we usually automatically try to fight it or we try to hide it, right? Number two, go slowly. Try to, to go slowly. This is not easy. And it's not easy because when anxiety is triggered, adrenaline has been released. So this gives us a lot of speed. It's very difficult to go slowly when you're under anxiety, but just try to go a little bit slowly. And often people are in a rush, then they rush very much because it kind of, especially men with their erection, it might be, okay, I'm getting my erection, so I don't want to lose it. So I need to complete the penetration before I lose it. And it also, the same thing happens with ejaculation. So this really messes everything up even more. So go slowly, because as we said, we're not trying to, intervene in the process. We're trying to just accept and be there, allow it. Number three, direct your attention all the time towards the now and your sensations. It's very natural that our attention is going to be focusing all the time on monitoring our function, on, trying to assess the possible consequences. That's absolutely normal. That's what always happens with anxiety. But we can try to redirect our attention all the time on our experience. So even if somebody is, for example, kissing the other person, they can focus not on what the other person is feeling, but what they are feeling on their mouth, on their lips, on their tongue, or they're caressing someone, not what the other person is feeling, but what they feel on their fingers. So, and they can also feel their anxiety, right? Which is okay. And then number four is what you mentioned in the beginning. Remember your goal. Remember your goal. So what is your goal? In my point of view, I would say it's in a simple way. What's your job? So I think if you're having a partnered sexual encounter, your job can be to experience it as fully as possible and be there as fully as possible in a very open way, period. Maybe later you want to have, maybe later on you want to, get back to your penetration goals. But for now, this is not useful. So these are like 4 steps in a way, 4 things to keep in mind during sexual encounters. And this kind of slows everything down. I mean, it doesn't maintain anxiety. But then again, as I mentioned before, of course, not everybody, some people might find it very difficult to apply these steps. Some people might find it a bit easier than others. It depends on our beliefs, our personality, our circumstances.
In those situations where the partner just is not on board with what's going on and they don't want to accept kind of maybe how it's being worked on, or they don't feel like they can see the progress that's being made, which you can't always, right? Especially with like an erection. If it hasn't happened after the 5th time, you can't see that progress is being made. Have you experienced that? I'm assuming you have.
Of course.
And if so, how do you help your client work through that?
Well, I think that in most cases, this kind of dynamic between the couple is evident in other aspects of the relationship as well. So, a partner that is demanding, that is not willing really, to be flexible, to understand the other person. Usually it's like that in many aspects, not only on the sexual aspect. So it's important to, again, help the person that is going through this to, in a way, be loyal to how they feel rather than constantly try to satisfy the other person.
Right. And which is so difficult when maybe if you're an anxious person in general, you kind of get stuck in that, right?
Exactly.
And that people pleasing.
Exactly. And for a lot of people, this is the way they have learned to relate with anyone is, I believe that I can maintain the relationship as long as I respond to your expectations and I cover your needs. This is why therapy is useful and interesting. As I said before, when I start therapy, it's always the mechanics, right? That, anxiety means that, this happens in your body, you don't have an erection but then after a while, you start understanding the complexity and we start to synthesize because we start to understand ourselves. But that's usually a bit later on if needed.
So what could a partner do to help their partner if they're having sexual performance anxiety?
I think that they don't need to try to help the partner. I think it's that they need to try to contribute to their own experience in the best way. I think that the best thing to do is to try to understand how the other person feels. They can also express how they feel and kind of be together in this process.
Simple. Focus on yourself and kind of the connection.
Yes, because we don't want, and you know that I'm sure very well in therapy, we don't want a couple where one person is the one who has a problem and the other is the one who's who's a nurse, right? We don't want that kind of logic. And as you said before, if, for example, a woman says, I don't have desire anymore, we have been experiencing this problem for 5 years. He wasn't seeking treatment for it while I was asking for it. And now I don't have desire. She's not a robot. You can't say, okay, you need to have desire now because now we're trying to treat it. We really need to understand her just as much.
We've touched on this a bit throughout the interview, but do you have any kind of final thoughts on why we don't discuss sexual performance anxiety in society, even though it's incredibly common?
As I said before, I think our society has a very specific idea of how exactly we should behave, respond, feel, etc. So when we feel that, we're not there, then it's very challenging. The second thing is that most of us have been raised in cultures where our emotions are completely disregarded, especially the emotions that are uncomfortable. We consider them as like something that hinders us, something that we should avoid, something that we need to reverse right away. But, you're a psychologist, so you know very much that these emotions are very, very helpful because they help us understand our needs. For example, when we feel hungry and we feel this uncomfortable feeling, it's very critical that we feel it because this way we know that we have the need to eat. And if we don't do that, we're going to die. So it's a weakness not to recognize this feeling of hunger. Because if we didn't recognize it, then we wouldn't eat and we would die. So in a similar way, emotions function also. So if I feel some kind of, say, fear or anxiety or, I'm not going to go into details now, but it means that there's something there that is meaningful to me. So I think that it's nice to know that, I do care about what you're going to think about this interview, for example. Did I help you? Did I meet your expectations, etc.? This is my need, and therefore it's good to know how I function. So unfortunately, we're not trained in the way we were brought up and in our society to recognize our emotions, especially men, right? So when anxiety occurs, we don't know what to do with it.
Yeah. With your paper in general, do you feel that there are a few sort of key points that you would like people to take away?
It's a scientific paper, so it's directed more to, therapists, etc. We tried to, bring together all the literature that we've had, all the knowledge that we've had up till now, and try to build a framework of how to manage it. But we wanted to open up a discussion again. in the scientific field. Now, for the people that are watching us, as I said before, I think the key issue that I would like to say is that anxiety is perfectly normal. It's part of our life. We experience it 20, 30 times a day for different issues, right? But what kind of keeps it maintained and triggered in specific situations is often the fact that we are fighting against it. If we just allow it to happen and pay more attention on what there is now, I think it's going to be better.
For someone who is a very anxious person in general, would your recommendation be to kind of say they have an anxiety diagnosis, like generalized anxiety disorder? Would your recommendation be to start with treating that? Or would you kind of do this treatment with your new clinical model at the same time?
That's interesting. We have another publication that is going to be out. I mean, it was accepted yesterday. So it will be out. Yeah, thank you. Dave Rowland is also one of the participants, myself and two more people, where we're actually talking about the different types of anxiety that are often involved in sexual dysfunctions. So that means that somebody that is experiencing a sexual dysfunction may be experiencing sexual performance anxiety, but at the same time, they might be experiencing other types of anxiety linked to the sexual situation. And these different phases of anxieties can be quite different sometimes, and they might require different interventions. So I would say that if somebody has like a lot of anxiety or maybe some kind of anxiety disorder, etc., I would say that I think they need to seek treatment from a therapist that can assess this, understand what kind of anxiety disorder, what are the characteristics, and find the best way to intervene. I would say that it's very difficult for someone to deal with it on their own, and I wouldn't suggest that.
Yeah, I agree.
But you're right. And thank you for mentioning this because, as you said, it's very different. If I am somebody who has sexual performance anxiety and I've been dealing with it for like 1 or 2 months within a nice, stable relationship, it's completely different to someone that has experienced it for many years, is alone, is lonely also. And again, it's completely different to somebody that is also experiencing other types of anxiety.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much. Is there anything else that you feel like we haven't touched on that would be important for someone to know about?
I can say also that it might be useful to your audience. I have made a website which is for men that are experiencing performance anxiety with erectile dysfunction. It's called mindmyerection.com. And in there are different videos where they can get some information about how to manage it. A lot of what we covered is there, maybe more in detail, etc. And there are also a few videos for the partner. I made this because I think it's very important for people to have some first information before they seek treatment, or if it's right in the beginning of the first experience, maybe this can be helpful to stop it from being triggered even more.
Thank you. That's fantastic. I'm definitely going to include that in the show notes. How can people keep up to date with your work if they want to follow what you do?
Well, probably LinkedIn is one way.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. What you're doing is excellent. And thank you for doing it. And thank you for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to talk about this topic.
I think one of the main takeaways from this episode is what Evie said about sexual performance anxiety and how you shouldn't fight it. So the moment that you try to suppress it or kind of wrestle it into submission, you really get stuck in the anxiety. So what actually helps is being brave enough to tolerate it. And I think we can probably all agree that that's not what most of us want to hear, right? Because who wants to essentially marinate in their own anxiety when they're trying to have sex? It really feels counterproductive. So we then put pressure on ourselves and we get really self-critical, exactly what we talked about in the previous episode. And none of that works, yet it makes complete sense why we do it if you think about how we live in general. So as Evie pointed out, we pretty much control everything in our daily lives. So we don't eat when we're hungry, we don't wee when we need to, we don't rest when we're tired. we essentially schedule our basic biological needs around things like work and convenience. Then we take that same mindset and we apply it to our sex lives, while simultaneously, and this is my experience in the field, we often believe that sexuality should be this spontaneous and biological force that can't be controlled. And it's an interesting paradox, isn't it? So what most people want when it comes to sex is the opposite of control. We want sex to feel immersive and present and kind of out of our heads, in our bodies, out of performance mode. We want it to feel like we're completely letting go. But then the more anxious we get, the more we try to control it. And that moves us further away from the very thing that we're craving, which is that connection and immersion and pleasure. And one of the other things I found really striking in my conversation with Evie was that she mentioned this study where they looked at people from 18 all the way up to 80 in Greece, where she's based, and 40% of people reported some kind of sexual problem. And of course, I know how common sexual difficulties are, but I do think that when you hear a number like that, it just shows how sex for a lot of people is so difficult. And when we're struggling, we feel really alone and we feel broken and we assume something is seriously wrong with us because we're the only ones who have this issue. But the data shows that problems are incredibly common and they happen at every age. So what I see a lot, or have seen a lot with younger clients is, and when I say younger clients, I'm talking about people, especially in their sort of early 20s or maybe even early 30s, is there's often this extra layer of shame because we have this cultural belief that when we're young, sex is easy. So I've even heard women say things like, I mean, it's not like I'm a 60-year-old woman who's been through menopause, right? As if sexual problems are reserved for people later in life. And even then, almost as if they shouldn't hurt us that much. And not that that's what my clients say, right? That last part specifically. But culturally, I really feel that that is kind of the implicit idea. But I've worked with clients well into their 80s. And trust me when I say struggling sexually at 85 can feel just as disheartening as struggling at 25. And the struggle sexually, yes, there are more physiological components when you're 85, but just because that's true, it doesn't mean that struggling at 25 is abnormal or that you're weird or broken, right? So if you're struggling with performance anxiety or your partner is, I want you to know that you're not alone and there is so much you can do. So try the strategies that Evie shared. And please remember when you do that, that what you're doing is incredibly brave. Because to be anxious and to still choose to meet that anxiety head on is the very definition of being brave, right? You can't be brave if there's no fear. You're working against your body's natural urge when you're anxious to fight or suppress. And you're choosing to feel it and stay with it. And most importantly, when you do that, move through it. And that's hard. And I think it really deserves that recognition. And if you want more support, especially if you're noticing desire dropping because anxiety keeps sort of creeping into your sex life, I just want to remind you that this is exactly the kind of thing that my program Redesire helps you with. And it gives you a sort of step-by-step way of rebuilding desire and easing anxiety, reconnecting with your body, and making sex enjoyable again without that pressure or those performative expectations. If you're interested, the link is in my show notes. That's it for In Bed with Science. Please remember that everything shared in this episode is for informational purposes only and is not a substitute for medical advice or therapy. For personal support, please reach out to a qualified professional. Thanks for listening.